I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'd like to talk about planetary charity. But before we dive into the details of planetary charity, I'd like to talk about why am I even doing this? Planetary charity is a concept, a practice that comes from Vedic astrology, so it's not really part of traditional astrology, Western astrology. So why am I doing it? Do I just go along and sort of pick up things willy-nilly and just throw them into my practice, or do I have some deeper basis, philosophical or practical basis for why I'm incorporating planetary charity and other perhaps non-traditional concepts or practices into my traditional work? Now, it's a little bit of a strange question for modern astrologers because modern astrology as a school tends to basically just pick up whatever comes along. There's a basic, often unconscious sort of set of principles that are used, but for the most part, the practical technique is sort of a collage technique. There's many different techniques from different schools, whether it's Hellenistic or Vedic or traditional or modern. We can go into New Age. These are all sort of combined by the individual astrologer. Now, obviously, there's some continuities and there's things that people have in common, but it's really not seen to be a problem. If I don't understand something or if I don't like something, I don't do it. Traditional astrology has a different approach. It's more of again, traditional. And there's a certain amount of respect for our predecessors, even if we don't understand something. If it's part of the tradition, we tend to follow it unless there's some, major problem with it, just as our default. And so I've been very leery about immediately synthesizing. If you look at traditional astrology, it comes from Arabic astrology, which developed in the 9th and 10th centuries by Arabic-speaking astrologers, often who are Christian or Muslim or Jewish, from a synthesis of Hellenistic, Vedic, and Persian astrology. Now, those astrologers really were geniuses, and I really don't necessarily feel I'm up to that level. I mean, recently I sort of added one fixed star into my practice that hadn't been in the traditional sources directly. And that's about as 20 years before I did that. So I'm very cautious about adding stuff in. Nevertheless, I am willing to add things in, like planetary charity, if it makes sense to me. So if we look at planetary charity, it comes from Vedic astrology, which is coming from the greater Indian religious practice. And so if you go to India, you can actually find temples of Jupiter. So if you wanted to get in contact with Jupiter, you could do a talisman, but you could actually go to a temple as well. And that points to a really interesting difference between what I'm sort of pulled towards and what looks in our sources. So if you look at our traditional sources, it's basically sort of how do you get stuff. So for example, if you want wealth, you'd say do a Jupiter talisman and say, well, it gets you wealth, it gets you, certain things. And if you make the talisman, you get the stuff. Or you destroy your enemies, or, there's all sorts of different purposes that you can do it. If we dig through the strata of that, though, for example, if we look at Picatrix, Book 3, Chapter 7, we have the invocations of the planets from the Haranian Sabians, who are a pagan, basically hermetic, had a religious approach in which the planets and the stars were gods. That was their religion. So there's a deeper strata of a more devotional approach, and that's what I increasingly find myself pulled toward, and why the Vedic astrology is so attractive to me, because I'm finding myself more and more a celestial priest as opposed to an astrological magician. I have this 20-year long-term relationship with the planets and with the other fixed stars and mansions of the moon, those spirits. I tend to approach them as spirits, as personalities. All of which, this is not the only approach. I mean, you can look upon a talisman as essentially a battery that you're charging with a sort of energy, and that you've got, again, a specific purpose you're trying to accomplish with it. And that's certainly very much, I think, really the mainstream of from our sources what we're doing. But it's not the only possibility. And personally, I do like the devotional approach. I don't feel like I have to protect myself. I don't do protective circle. I don't have to worry about the backlash from these spirits. I really only deal with the archangelic manifestations of them. And so I mean, usually the worst blowback that people will get is they'll report no effect. But we just generally don't have people saying, oh no, I screwed up, I didn't wear this particular sigil, and then the spirit escaped from the protective thing, and I had all these terrible effects. And we're not making deals. Essentially, these are like saints, and you don't go to Saint Joseph and say, okay, Saint Joseph, if you give me what I want, I'm going to give you a certain, rum and cigars or whatever. I'll sacrifice a chicken to you. That's not the normal approach for saints. I mean, I think some people do approach them that way. Or it's like these are very powerful, positive beings, and you can ask them for things, and they may or may not give it to you depending on what they think is best for you. And again, there are people that approach does not appeal to, that they want to be able to command. I mean, a lot of the Solomonic grimoires are much more demanding and authoritative in their approach. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad approach or a wrong approach. It's just what I feel myself pulled toward. And that's what everyone needs to be doing, is finding the approach that really appeals to them, and that really it inspires them, because that's the one that you're going to get the best results from. And it makes no sense to go around criticizing other people's approaches, since again all these are valid within the tradition. So the planetary charity springs out of this devotional approach and comes from an idea of these planets as essentially as archangelic spirits, or even gods or devas in the Buddhist or Hindu traditions. And so when we look at, at least again, this is my approach with talismans, when we look at your natal chart, if we look at the essential dignity of a planet, that kind of gives us a rough indication of what your preset relationship is with that planet. So for example, in my chart, I have Jupiter is in very well dignified in Pisces. It's his sign. So right off the bat, I have a good relationship with Jupiter. So if I have a Jupiter talisman or do a Jupiter ritual or Jupiter invocation, I tend to get good results. And I have seen, for example, I remember doing a Jupiter talisman many years ago, doing the ritual, and then coming back and opening up my mailbox 45 minutes later, and there was a very large check. Now, I'd earned the money. It didn't come out of nowhere, but that's the point at which the money chose to show up right after I did the Jupiter invocation. On the other hand, if the planets are afflicted in your chart, you sort of have a problematic relationship with them. And the talismans of that planet, it doesn't mean that you're going to get a 100% bad result. It's not deadly for you, but the results are even more unpredictable than normal. You might get a good result. I had someone who bought a Jupiter talisman and called me up and said, the first day I got the talisman, I got this great job. And I said, hey, we should look at your natal chart. He had Jupiter in Capricorn in fall, yet was able to get a good result. Afflicted planets, my experience is that they're just very variable in the results. And most people are looking for good results and don't want to have that increased uncertainty about what the results are. I have had some more advanced students who have gotten talismans of planets afflicted in their charts or worked with those planets extensively, and they've reported that they've had difficulties, but they were useful for their sort of spiritual quest. But a lot of people are not interested in having difficulties, don't want to have problems, they want to have positive results. And so that's why I tend to recommend talismans of planets that are well dignified for an essential dignity. Again, not aspects, not house placement, but essential dignity. And a lot of this, again, this is not from traditional sources, this is built up from my experience. That's what I do, and again, I'm not saying that's the only way to fly. So what do you do with afflicted planets? That's where the planetary charity comes in. So basically what the planetary charity is that you invoke the planet, and you make an oath, and you say, I promise that I'm going to make a donation to a person or things ruled by you for a certain number of repetitions. And so if you look on my website, if you search planetary charity, you can come up with a very detailed explanation of how to do this. But for example, for Saturn, if Saturn was afflicted in your chart and you wanted to have a better relationship with Saturn, have him kind of ease up on you, what you could do is to invoke him and then say, look, I'm going to make a donation to a homeless person, which is ruled by Saturn. And I'm going to do that 9 times in a row or whatever. There's, again, Agrippa gives numbers for the planets. That's a useful thing to do. The most important thing is that once you make the oath, you don't want to break it. You'll say, oh, well, I'm busy, I got something else going on. This needs to be the most important thing going on. If you make the oath, start, and then stop, it's even, it's worse than not doing it at all. It's very disrespectful to the planet. It's not very helpful. It's not that they're going to necessarily attack you, but it's just disrespectful. And it's basically not following the purpose of the charity, which is to show your respect and to improve the relationship. It's like a friend promising to do something for them and not doing it. They may not come after you, but they're certainly not going to be that happy with you. So having made this oath and making the donation, I mean, like I said, you know, a homeless person, if you live in a city, they're probably right there for you. The children of Saturn are right available all over the streets. For other things, for example, like the sun, government, you know, celebrities or something, you know, in America, you may end up having a middle-class person, you may end up having to do an internet donation, which is fine. It's probably better to do it directly, but if you don't have any other choice, you don't just give up. And in terms of rulership, again, you can look at links on my page on the planets to see what planets rule which different things. So what this planetary charity is doing is going to, again, to this devotional idea is that you're having all of us have the planets, the outside and inside of us. We have this preset relationship depending on our chart and also the work that we've done, you know, ritual work or you know, the things that we've interacted with that planet and that spirit. And we want to try to improve that. So rather than getting a talisman of that planet and really intensifying the effect of them, which may or may not be good in our life, by doing the planetary charity, it's a very safe way of interacting with that planet, with that spirit, and seeing if we can improve your relationship and then get the positive effects from that. So, you know, I find that people like to buy stuff, so the talismans are attractive from that standpoint. So, you know, I probably sell a lot more talismans than people do planetary charity. But if you're serious about improving your relationship and serious about working with the planets, then planetary charity is what I do. I don't recommend, I mean, again, in Vedic astrology, sometimes they'll say, well, the planet's afflicted, get the talisman of that planet. I haven't followed that approach, and I've sort of laid out why. Again, it doesn't seem invalid to me, but it's not the approach that I follow. And so the more you're sort of drawn into a particular area, I think the stronger it is. And again, that goes to my initial point, is that you need to find the approach that really draws you. And certainly, you know, again, traditional or modern, much more popular, many more people do that. But if you find traditional to be something that draws you, then you want to follow the practices of traditional astrology. So if you go to my website, renaissanceastrology.com, I have a whole page on planetary charity that sort of lays it out how to do it. So this video is really more intended as sort of an introduction to let people know about it, to make them aware of it, and then you can go to the page and then dive into the details of that planetary charity there. And also in terms of finding out if you can do traditional astrology, you can look at your chart and see the essential dignity of the planets. If not, you might want to look at getting a reading. Any of my natal readings will lay out, you know, in detail the strength and weakness of the planets. And also I do a talismanic prescription for all natal readings. And then I'll suggest planetary charity for those planets that are afflicted, and also talismans for the planets that are either weak, unafflicted, or are strong in your chart. So I think that's a really interesting introduction to planetary charity. It's something that isn't in the tradition, Western tradition, but nevertheless I think it fits in very well. And my experience with it has been good. The people that have done it have reported positive results. And therefore, you know, as much as I'm a little reluctant to synthesize, this isn't something that I think can fit into a traditional practice very well. As we're sort of reconstructing it, as we're coming back and reviving this traditional astrological magic. And that's really what I've been focused on for the past 20 years. When I started back in 1998, no traditional astrologer was doing astrological magic. I was basically the first person to do it. And so I'm very happy to see that this has become much more popular, more people are interested in it, and I'm very happy to share my experiences without trying to say that this is the only way or the best way, but just useful to look at somebody who's kind of devoted themselves for 20 years to that. It's interesting to take a look at my approach. I hope people take it seriously, and then you can decide for yourself how you want to proceed. So again, take a look at that planetary charity page. Very interesting and very useful, and I hope that people are able to make use of it and start getting a better relationship with the problematic planets in their natal chart.